in the biting darkness that settles each night just beyond the highlands of Inverness, where cold becomes more than a sensation, it becomes a force. There lives a village almost forgotten by time. Here, winter does not ease its grip. It seizes everything. And tonight, as wind-torn shutters clatter like distant drums, I want to tell you a story about a young woman named Edda, a peasant born into this relentless ice. You might expect a tale of hardship, and you're right, but it's also a story of unbreakable spirit, quiet innovation, and enduring love. Imagine stepping into her tiny one-room hut. The air inside is slightly less freezing than the wind outside, but only just. Frost creeps across the small patches of earthen floor that aren't obscured by worn straw, bending toward the single embers dimly glowing in a hearth at the center. Those embers are the only barrier between life and the icy darkness. Yet they're as unpredictable as anything else in this brutal land. Edda's breath is visible the moment she opens her mouth, each exhale drifting upward like pale ghosts. She is 17, but her eyes carry the weight of many winters. Her childhood was not marked by games or lessons, but by silent resolve and quiet invention. She wakes hours before dawn, with fingers already stiff and numb, to coax those embers into flame. Because if the fire dies tonight, tomorrow might be the end. Even now, you might think this is just another historical talent, another sad portrait of village life centuries ago. But you're wrong, because within this small, fragile home lies a series of decisions made in desperation that aren't just clever, they're revolutionary. Edda's mother, Maren, was the first to taste danger when she stepped outside one midwinter evening, her lantern guttering as gale-force winds threatened to snuff it out, and almost did, bringing that life-preserving glow safely back inside. Taught Edda the weight of hope and the art of prevention. One lost lantern could mean a neighbor bleeding to death in frost. One preserved spark could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. On her way home, Maren passed through a grove of frozen Hibernian pines. There, she discovered moss clinging to stones half buried under snow. It had survived sheer cruelty by wrapping itself into thick cushions. That night, she carried handfuls of it inside. Edda watched, mesmerized. That moss later earned her the village's eternal gratitude. When she stuffed it into every gap in their wattle and daub walls, and around their tiny window opening plenty, to make a traveler wonder if the cabin were alive. So now, as dawn slowly bleeds through cracks in the door, Edda stands before that hearth. She tips a log onto the embers and breathes on them, coaxing flame. She presses her hands against the hearthstones and feels warmth sink into her skin, proof that tonight, like so many nights before, she has beaten the cold. And in that moment, you understand what might seem hopelessly hopeless to someone watching from a distance is actually the most precious heartbeat of resilience. In these frozen nights, hope comes in small packages: the half-glow of a hearth, a handful of moss, the faint whisker of warmth along a polished stone warmed in the hearth fire and tucked under the covers. These small triumphs add up, shaping a life and forging a spirit capable of standing against the fiercest storms. That spirit is what drove Edda to examine everything she touched: the straw that insulated her bed, the ash that could be patted over coals to bank the fire, the wool remnants that might fill tiny pillows to warm her siblings' feet. In her eyes, every scrap had purpose. Every failure taught something new, and she devoured each lesson faster than the flames devoured kindling. I want you to imagine living those nights with her, hours in near motionless stillness, the ceiling bending low with cold, the wind rattling the roof like dozens of invisible fists. To live there was to master fear and doubt, without ever announcing your victory. It was to wake each morning slightly numb, but alive. And alive was everything. Because when you've stared into the cold's unrelenting face and then coaxed a flame from nothing, you don't just survive, you become part of a lineage of defiance. You carry forward a whisper of eternity, one breath, one ember, one narrow escape at a time. That's what this story is really about, not just endurance, but metamorphosis. It's about how ordinary people, faced with extraordinary challenges, can create moments of magic in the most unlikely places. It's about community, about inherited wisdom stitched together like quilt patches from generation to generation. And it's about the fact that, even tonight, somewhere in our world, someone is turning small sparks into flickers of hope just like Edda did. If you're drawn into that spark, and believe me, you will be, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. Because the story doesn't end with survival. It grows, it inspires, and your support helps make sure there are more stories waiting, more embers to rekindle, more unknown heroes to discover in places you'd never expect. Hit subscribe now and be part of this journey, because every like, every subscriber helps us light another flame. Now, I have a question for you. What do you think helped Edda survive that first brutally cold winter the most? A. Her ingenuity at insulating her home. B. Her dedication to keeping the hearth alive. Comment your answer below, A or B. Can't wait to see what you think, and I'll be reading every comment. There was a silence that lived in the stone hearth at the center of Edda's home, not a silence of absence, but one of reverence. In Glenleith, fire wasn't just heat. It was memory, heritage, love, and faith forged in flame. To outsiders, it may have seemed primitive, blackened pit of soot, smoke, and cinder, but to the people who relied on it to survive the biting cold, it was everything. Especially to Edda, who had come to understand that tending a fire was not merely a task, but a kind of sacred stewardship. The hearth was the first thing Edda saw when she opened her eyes each morning, and the last thing she checked before she let sleep take her. Its embers didn't just illuminate the room, they illuminated her purpose. When the wind howled outside and frost bloomed across the wooden beams, the flickering orange light cast moving shadows that danced across the walls, telling stories older than the village itself. It was her grandfather Torben who had taught her the ancient discipline of firekeeping. His hands, scarred from years of blacksmithing and gathering wood, moved over the embers with a gentleness that seemed to contradict their strength. He spoke of fire as if it were alive, a temperamental elder, powerful and proud. You don't tame fire, he once whispered to Edda, brushing ash from a charred log. You befriend it, you treat it with honor, and it will carry you through the darkest months. Edda never forgot that. Every evening, after the stew pot was scrubbed and the walls had been checked for drafts, she would kneel by the hearth and perform the ritual of banking the fire. It involved carefully scooping ash over the remaining coals to insulate them, keeping them alive until morning. If done right, they would smolder quietly, waiting to roar again at sunrise. It was a slow, tender process, part science, part instinct. She learned how to listen to the way the coals whispered, how to read the color of their glow, how to know exactly when to feed or starve the flame. The hearth was also where the family gathered, not because it was warm, but because it was the emotional center of their world. Around its glow, her brother Magnus would lie with his eyes wide open, begging for just one more story. Her mother Maren, hair falling loose from her scarf, would hum songs while mending clothes, letting her voice blend with the crackle of burning wood. And Torben would sit closest, elbows on knees, spinning stories that braided fact and fable into threads that warmed even the iciest night. In those moments, the fire was more than fire. It was a council chamber, a chapel, a theater. Arguments faded in its glow. Fears, even the silent ones no one dared name, were soothed by its steadiness. When Magnus woke crying from dreams of wolves or shadowy figures outside the door, it was the fire they turned to first, not words. Its light became a kind of reassurance that all things terrifying lived only beyond its reach. One night, when the temperature dropped so low that the panes of oiled parchment on the windows cracked like eggshells, the fire began to fail. The wind had grown wild, angry, slamming against the house until the walls quivered. The stack of wood was damp from unexpected snow, and the logs hissed and spat rather than caught flame. Edda fought panic with instinct. She remembered Torben's words, and she reached for the last ball of animal fat-soaked wool, tucked high on a shelf for emergencies. She lit it, then held her breath as the flame caught and flickered to life. That single, stubborn flame saved them. In the days that followed, that story traveled, not just because of the ingenuity, but because of the feeling. Everyone in Glenleith knew that one of the worst dangers wasn't the cold, it was hopelessness. And when a single flame endured, it gave courage to others, even beyond her family's walls. The hearths of the village were extensions of each other. When firewood ran low, someone always shared. When the hearth in a neighbor's home went out, someone from Edda's family would carry embers wrapped in clay to reignite it. There was no pride in withholding warmth, the act of sharing. Fire was an ancient bond, unspoken but universal. It said, "I see you, I know your fear, and I will not let you face it alone." Edda began to realize that what made the hearth sacred was not its heat, it was its connection. It pulled people close in body and soul. It demanded presence, required patience, taught gratitude. Fire was not instant. It asked something of you: time, attention, care. In that way, it mirrored love. On the coldest nights, when even Magnus wouldn't joke and Maren's lips turned pale from worry, it was the fire that held them all. They would sit, limbs tangled beneath layers of blankets, watching the flame rise and fall. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things they didn't have to say aloud. Years later, when Edda would tell her own children about those winters, she would not speak first of hunger, or of aching feet, or nights without sleep. She would speak of the fire, the one they kept alive, the one that kept them alive. And she would tell them this: the true warmth of fire isn't in its flame, but in the people who gather around it. That was the lesson her grandfather gave her, and the one she carried through every bitter season thereafter. There was no illusion of comfort in the house where Edda lived. From the outside, it looked like little more than a pile of straw clinging desperately to a skeleton of wood and mud, leaning into the earth as if hoping to disappear into it. But to those inside, those who had braved the winds of Glenleith, winter, it was more than a shelter. It was the embodiment of will, of adaptation, and of the human spirit refusing to shatter beneath nature's weight. The structure had no grandeur, no strong beams carved with artisan skill, no stone foundation, no iron nails. It was built with what the earth reluctantly gave: fallen branches, hand-woven wattle, and a daub of mud, dung, and straw slapped and packed with bare hands. The walls breathed with the wind, bending, cracking, and groaning, but they stood. Year after year, storm after storm, they stood. Not because they were indestructible, but because they were made by people who never stopped fixing, patching, improving. Edda's mother, Maren, was the mind behind much of the house's unseen genius. She understood that survival depended on noticing the small things: how cold crept through certain corners, how the draft favored the eastern wall, how the roof sagged, not from snow alone, but from moisture absorbed through years of rainfall. She had once taught Edda to listen to the house like she would listen to a sick animal: quiet signs, subtle symptoms, clues hidden in groans and cracks. It was during one particularly brutal winter, the kind that made your breath crackle in the air and froze water inside sealed buckets, that Maren developed a new mixture for the daub used on their walls. She ground eggshells into powder and mixed them with the ash from the hearth and dried moss scraped from the stone well. The result was surprisingly durable, stronger, more resistant to splitting. It smelled earthy and faintly of burnt wood, but it kept the cold out better than anything else they'd tried. From then on, everyone in Glenleith began saving eggshells, stuffing them into clay jars for future walls. The roof, too, was a challenge of its own. Thatch made from swamp reeds had to be tightly bound with twine soaked in animal fat, a technique passed down from Torben's mother. It kept water from soaking the binding and forming ice inside, which could tear the whole roof apart if left unchecked. Edda often found herself climbing up there, boots slipping on icy beams, stuffing handfuls of new thatch under sagging patches with fingers so cold she couldn't feel the splinters until hours later. And yet, she never hesitated. It wasn't pride or obligation, it was the instinct to protect. Inside the house, there were no rooms, just spaces, separated by purpose. A straw mat laid near the fire became the kitchen. A corner behind a hanging blanket was the bedroom shared by Edda and Magnus. The loft above the door, too low to stand in, was where they kept cured meat and spare wool. But what the house lacked in elegance, it made up for in intention. Every object had a story. Every wall bore fingerprints. They hung herbs from the rafters, not only to dry them for medicine, but to fill the air with scent. Lavender, sage, and winter mint masked the odors of smoke, sweat, and livestock. Over the hearth, Maren had tied a braided loop of animal hair and colored thread in old ward against cold spirits, passed from her grandmother. It swung slightly with the drafts, its motion oddly calming, Edda's own contribution to the houses. Evolution came one bitter evening when the north wind howled through a split between the wall slats. She noticed the way cold air slipped through, no matter how much cloth they stuffed into the gaps. The next morning, she took 2 flat stones, heated them by the hearth, and buried them shallowly into the base of the wall behind their sleeping spot. With a wool blanket pressed between the stones and the inner wall, they created what she would call a warm buffer. It was simple. It worked. They slept easier that night. What made the house remarkable wasn't the materials, it was the love sewn into every repair, every patch of straw pressed into the roof, every knotted string tied to reinforce the door. It wasn't built to impress. It was built to endure, and in that endurance came identity. When other houses collapsed or had to be abandoned for the winter, Edda's family stayed. They were known in the village not for wealth or position, but for the strength of their walls and the warmth within them. Not warmth from fire alone, but from hands that never stopped working, hearts that never stopped believing that each improvement, no matter how small, could mean another day of survival. That house stood as a testament not to power, but to presence to the idea that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't grand. It's quiet, it's slow, it's daily. It's a girl pressing cracked mud between wall slats with frostbitten fingers while her brother hums softly beside her. It's a mother hanging dried moss from the rafters and calling it beautiful. It's a grandfather watching, silently proud, as his family turns broken things into blessings. In the harshest corner of the world, where even sunlight seemed to struggle, that home became a fortress not of stone, but of soul. Nightfall in Glenleith didn't drift in gently, it descended like a weight. The kind of night that came with a silence so dense, it pressed against the skin, smothered sound, and stole the warmth from every corner it could reach. For Edda, sleep was not a simple retreat from the day's toil. It was a negotiation with the cold, and she knew better than most that to rest in a world like hers required strategy, rituals, and above all, resilience. There was no single bed waiting for her at day's end, no thick blankets or crackling stove. What Edda and her family had was a shared sleeping space, a haphazard tangle of old wool, furs, and straw mats that served as their communal bed. It wasn't comfort that mattered, it was proximity. Warmth was something you created together or not at all. The house, despite their best efforts, was a sieve for the wind. So the real insulation came from each other. Every night began with the same routine. As dusk fell, the fire was banked for the last time, and stones from the hearth were carefully removed and wrapped in cloth. These stones, heated to the brink of pain, were placed at the foot of the bedding pile to keep their legs from freezing. Maren had learned that technique from her mother and passed it on without ever calling it wisdom. It was just survival. Edda took her place beside Torben, who lay closest to the fire. Maren curled on the other side of Magnus, who stubbornly clung to his rooster, Fletch, as if the small animal could somehow guard him from the biting cold. Fletch didn't protest. Even the animals understood the necessity of shared body heat. They slept in layers, not just of cloth, but of memory and connection. First came the undergarments, stitched from worn linen, then the wool layers, tunic over tunic, sometimes still damp from the day's sweat, and finally, the cloaks, patched and heavy, tucked over them like shields. At times, Edda could feel the cold on her cheeks, even as her feet burned from the hearthstones. A strange mix of discomforts that somehow became familiar, but sleep was not immediate. The body could only rest when it trusted the conditions, and trust came slow. They whispered in the dark little nothings, old stories, silly jokes. Torben sometimes hummed songs that had no lyrics, tunes passed from his own father, whose name no one remembered, but whose music remained. Those sounds grounded them, lulled them, formed a kind of cocoon that existed within the cold, rather than beyond it. Edda had learned to listen for danger, even in dreams. A sudden stillness from the hearth meant the fire was dying. A draft across her neck meant a crack had opened in the thatch or wall. More than once, she'd woken to shift her position, pressing herself tighter against Magnus, or pulling a corner of wool up over Maren's shoulder. These were not dramatic gestures, just the quiet choreography of love in winter. Sometimes our sleep was broken not by fear, but by wonder. She would wake and see the shadows of the fire flickering softly across the beams above, dancing in patterns that almost seemed to form images of deer in the woods, of a river flowing, of things from another life. In those moments, when the cold had been held at bay and silence felt sacred instead of sharp, she felt something close to peace. There were nights that tested everything, nights when wind shrieked through the walls, when snow piled so high they could not open the door. Nights when the temperature dipped so low that Edda's breath froze in crystals on her hair. On those nights, sleep felt like defiance. To close your eyes and trust that warmth would hold, that the fire would last, that your heart would keep beating, that morning would come was a kind of victory, and morning always came, eventually. Slowly, painfully, with stiff joints and aching limbs, they would rise together, the fire now just a bed of gray ash. Edda would reach in, praying to find the faintest warmth. If she did, she'd coax it back to life with the same care a mother gives a newborn. If not, they'd begin again, striking steel to flint, breath clouding in the air as they built their world from scratch once more. Those nights weren't just endured, they were learned from. Over time, Edda became a master of sleep survival. She figured out that placing dried sage near their heads helped with breathing during the worst freezes. She crafted a kind of wind barrier using wool scraps and clay, jars placed in front of the bed to catch and break the chill. She began saving the softest bits of down from slaughtered hens and stitched them into small pouches to warm their hands. The art of sleeping through winter wasn't about escaping the cold. It was about learning how to live alongside it, how to find warmth in touch, in sound, in ritual. In the dark, there was a bond forged not only by blood, but by shared breath and trust. Edda knew that when spring came, she wouldn't remember every detail of the pain, but she would remember the closeness, the murmurs, the rising warmth between bodies that refused to surrender. In Glenleith, rest was not a reward, it was a strategy, a nightly negotiation with nature. And for Edda and her family, every night survived was not just another tick toward spring. It was proof that the cold could press against their home, but never inside their hearts. In Glenleith, survival wasn't just the work of one household. It was the quiet miracle of many hearts beating in sync. The bitter wind didn't recognize borders, and the frost did not discriminate. But within the shared hardship, something extraordinary had taken root. The village endured not because of individual strength, but because of the invisible threads that bound each life to the others. Warmth, in this place, was never a solitary pursuit. It lived in numbers, in the closeness of bodies, the sharing of embers. The unspoken covenant of care. Edd had grown up knowing that if their fire went out, they could knock on Brenna's door. And if Brenna's family ran short on stew, Torben would walk across the snowy path with a sack of turnips slung over his back. No ledger kept track, no tally counted these exchanges. They were instinct, tradition, the unshakable foundation of a people who understood that to live in a place like Glenleith, you had to be more than neighbors. You had to be kin, chosen not by blood, but by the cold. Every fortnight, when the snow wasn't too deep, the villagers gathered in what they called the wool circle. It was held in a different house, each time chosen by need, not by status. Sometimes it was the warmest home, other times the most damaged. The point wasn't comfort, it was connection. They brought scraps of yarn, old cloth, and unfinished knitting. They came with nothing and left with something: mittens, pieced together from 3 kinds of wool, a blanket stitched from clothes to worn to wear, and stories. It was around these gatherings that the true warmth of Glenleith revealed itself. Edda remembered one night in particular, when an old man named Halvard arrived, half frozen and empty-handed. His roof had collapsed, and he had nowhere to sleep. No one said a word of pity or complaint. Instead, Brenna pulled him into her family's circle. Maren handed him her spare scarf. Even Magnus offered up his small fur pillow without being asked. By the end of the evening, Halvard had a new place to rest and more food than he had expected. For the week, the children, too, played their part. They would sneak extra bits of bread to the goats of a neighbor who'd lost her flock. They built snow walls around the lowest windows of older homes, insulating them with laughter and ice. And when the wind howled too loud at night, they would gather in groups and sing the old songs passed down by the elders, not for melody, but for memory, and for the way the vibrations pushed back the silence. One of those elders was Edda, whose storytelling was itself a form of protection. Her tales, always told by firelight, often spoke of mythical beasts made of snow and shadow, driven back by the bravery of common folk working together. It wasn't hard to see the metaphors nor to miss how the youngest villagers sat a little straighter, held hands a little tighter when she spoke. Her stories were not just entertainment, they were blueprints for endurance. Even the design of the village had evolved around this shared survival. Houses were clustered closer than necessary, paths between them kept deliberately trodden. Every home had a share shelf, where surplus food, tools, or materials were left without expectation. Torben had once left a cured rabbit leg during a good week. The next time he passed by, it had been replaced by a bundle of dried nettle tea. No words, no thanks, just balance. On the worst nights, when the wind felt like it might rip the village from the earth, they lit what they called the lantern line. Families set out small candles in their windows, so that even the most isolated home could see a flicker in the distance. It was a silent message. We are still here. You are not alone. Edda had watched those lanterns through the warped window pane of her home, her breath fogging the glass, and felt something deeper than comfort. She felt anchored. The villagers understood something many others forgot, that the cold could take your fingers, your toes, even your breath, but it could never take what was freely given. And in Glenleith, warmth was given constantly, in small, steady gestures that didn't seek recognition. A loaf left on a doorstep, a song hummed in passing, a shared look that said, "I know how hard today was." Edda learned that heroism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a boy her age digging a path through the snow so that the old widow across the way could find her way to the wool circle. Sometimes it was her mother stitching a patch onto a coat that wasn't hers. Sometimes it was simply listening when someone had lost too much to speak. That winter, Glenleith didn't just survive, it grew stronger. The roots of their community, invisible and intertwined, ran deeper than the frost could reach. And in the midst of ice and scarcity, Edda saw the truest expression of abundance. It was not in what they owned, but in what they shared. The warmth they created together could never be charted on a map or measured in degrees, but it was real, and it was the reason that when spring finally came, it wasn't the thaw that brought relief, it was the knowledge that they had made it through, not alone, but together. Food in Glenleith during the deep winter was not about flavor or indulgence. It was survival, stretched, rationed, prayed over. But even within that desperate context, it became something more. In the hands of Edda and her family, it became ritual, invention, and at times, a reminder that they were still humans, still capable of finding joy, of feeding not just the body, but the soul. The root cellar, dug into the hard earth behind their home, was a sacred space, cold enough to preserve, dark enough to delay spoilage. It held the promise of continuity. Edda descended into it daily, navigating its damp stone steps with care, her fingers brushing across bundles of beets, turnips, and onions wrapped in cloth or buried in straw. Each piece of food had been placed there months earlier with purpose. Each bite already accounted for in Maren's meticulous winter planning. There were no feasts in the way the world might imagine, no tables groaning under the weight of roasted meat, no overflowing stews rich with spice. But what they lacked in plenty, they made up for in creativity and care. The main staple was a thick barley gruel, sometimes sweetened with dried apple slices when they were lucky, or stretched with marrow from bones boiled for hours. On the best nights, Maren added a pinch of salt or herbs hung and dried by the hearth, a simple change that felt like luxury. Edda watched her mother work in that small kitchen space with a reverence usually reserved for saints. Every movement was deliberate, every scrap, every rind, every bone was used. Broth made from vegetable ends simmered for days, becoming the base of meals that gave the illusion of fullness. Flat cakes made from ground oats and a bit of ash water provided sustenance for long days of mending and gathering. Nothing went to waste, not even the water from boiled vegetables, which was cooled and used to rehydrate dried mushrooms for the next day. Despite the scarcity, moments of celebration still emerged. They called it the midnight meal, a once-monthly gathering where the community would fast for a day and then bring together whatever they could contribute into a shared supper. It wasn't just about hunger, it was about humility. A single smoked fish, one loaf of rye bread, a pot of nettle tea, these became offerings in a silent agreement. We will not let this season strip us of our unity. One of the most unforgettable midnight meals happened during Edda's 15th winter. She had secretly been drying slivers of apple and hiding them in a cloth pouch behind the storage jars. When the evening came, she added them to the communal pot without saying a word. The sweetness surprised everyone, and for a brief moment, the room erupted in laughter and grateful tears. It wasn't about the apple. It was about the reminder that something unexpected could still bloom in the dark. There were innovations, too. Torben began boiling pine bark, scraping the inner soft layers and mixing it with oats to stretch the flour further. At first, the children protested at the bitterness, but after Edda discovered that soaking it in broth softened both taste and texture, it became a staple. Magnus nicknamed them storm biscuits, and somehow they stayed. Even the way they cooked shifted. Without enough fuel to keep a fire blazing all day, meals were prepped in the morning and buried in coals or wrapped in hot stones to cook slowly. This method passed from a neighboring family, saved wood, and softened the toughest cuts of meat. Meals were drawn out, not rushed, and they ate with the kind of focus reserved for sacred things. Perhaps the most surprising element of food during those months was how it became emotional memory. Each combination of root and herb, each aroma rising from the pot, carried a memory. The smell of garlic and broth reminded Maren of her mother. The scent of roasted turnip brought Torben back to his first winter with his late wife. And for Edda, there was a kind of hope in every stutha sense that with enough care, spring would come again, and green things would grow, and food would return not just as necessity, but as joy. The last harvest had been lean, and the cold came earlier than anyone expected, but they found ways. Edda invented a method for fermenting cabbage with salt and snow water, creating a briny vegetable mash that helped keep their stomachs steady, and immune systems stronger. It wasn't delicious, but it became essential. More than once, they went to bed hungry. And yet, more than once, they gave away what little they had to those worse off. A half-loaf left on a doorstep, a handful of dried greens delivered by Magnus under the cover of dusk. No one asked, no one thanked. That was the rhythm of the village, the quiet barter of compassion. In the heart of such a brutal season, food became the language they all spoke. A shared bowl meant alliance, a hot drink meant love, and every time they sat together, no matter how small the meal, they found something to be grateful for. Edda didn't dream of castles or grand feasts. She dreamed of one more month with enough barley, of one more stew pot scraping clean only because it was eaten, not spilled. She dreamed of mornings where frost didn't bite before sunrise, of days when she could walk to the cellar and know what she'd find. But most of all, she dreamed of the spring not for the warmth it would bring, but for the growth it promised. Because in Glenleith, food was never just food. It was proof that they were still alive, still together, and still willing to keep going. In the deep chill of Glenleith, there were winters that tested not just the strength of the body, but the endurance of the spirit. When warmth was scarce and food uncertain, what held Edda and her family together wasn't only the fire in their hearth or the straw in their walls. It was something deeper, quieter, and far more powerful. Belief, not just in God or fate, but in each other, in the memory of those who came before, and in the idea that survival had more to do with the mind than the muscle. Edda had long understood that fear lived in silence. It crept in during the still hours before dawn, whispering worst-case scenarios. The mind, when left alone in the dark, had a cruel imagination. But she also knew that faith was a flame that, once lit, could outlast even the harshest winds. And her family had taught her to tend that flame just as carefully as the one in the hearth. Each evening, just before night took full hold, Maren would light a small candle from the hearth and place it on the table. It wasn't meant to add warmth or light the room. It was symbolic. They called it the soul spark, a tradition Maren had inherited from her own mother. The flame was a promise that they were still here, still believing, still hoping. Even on nights when the wind shook the roof and the fire nearly failed, that tiny candle would flicker bravely in the dark, and it would be enough. Torben spoke little of religion, but he believed deeply in signs. He believed that a bird landing on the threshold in winter was a message from those who had passed. He taught Edda to read the way snow clung to trees or melted from certain stones. "The land speaks," he would say, running his hand over a frost-covered window, "and we listen." His faith wasn't one of temples or priests. It was of patterns and cycles, of trust in the earth to turn, in the sun to return, in the soul to endure. Magnus, still young and open to wonder, believed in legends. Edda once found him whispering to the icicles that hung from the rafters, convinced that they could carry wishes to the stars. And rather than laugh, she joined him. She told him about the old tale of the Frost Watcher, a spirit who protected families that stayed close and kind. In a world where logic could only take you so far, story was often the last defense against despair. There were moments when even Edda doubted, when the snow piled too high and the cold sank too deep, when her fingers wouldn't stop shaking and the world felt too quiet. But those were the moments she returned to what she'd been taught. Breathe slowly, speak your fear aloud, and remind yourself of what's true. She'd whisper affirmations under her breath, not prayers, exactly, but something like them. We are alive. We are warm. We have tomorrow. It was enough to steady her heartbeat. The villagers, too, had their rituals. On the first full moon of each year, they carved small alcoves into snowbanks and placed candles inside. It was called the snow light. The whole village glowed for a night. No one spoke of survival or struggle, just of light in the darkness. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was necessary. It reminded them that beauty could still be made. Even now, even here, and every so often, they sang. There was one song, old and wordless, that Isolde would hum at the wool circle, a haunting, rising melody that began with a hum and ended in silence. No one knew where it came from, but every elder knew it. Edda learned it by ear, and on nights when Magnus had trouble sleeping, she'd hum it to him. It wasn't music in the traditional sense. It was memory passed through melody, a connection to the people who had endured before them, a mental bridge through the cold. Faith in Glenleith wasn't about escaping the cold. It was about believing they were more than what it could take from them. It was about community, symbols, rituals, and the refusal to let fear dictate the story. Edda knew she couldn't control the weather, but she could control how she met it. She could choose hope. She could hold on to belief when everything else felt brittle. She once told Magnus, during a particularly bitter night, that the strongest part of any shelter wasn't its roof or its walls, it was the belief that they would make it through. That belief turned every repair into a declaration, every meal into an act of rebellion, every laugh into proof that the cold hadn't won. And perhaps that was the secret. The cold could strip them of comfort, could test their resilience, but it could never take away their will to believe. Not in magic, necessarily, but in meaning, in one another, in the quiet, unshakable truth that their minds were stronger than the storm. History rarely records the quiet victories. The world remembers kings and conquerors, saints and scholars, but it forgets the everyday ingenuity that allowed ordinary people to survive winters that should have ended them. In Glenleith, those heroes weren't dressed in armor or robes. They wore patched tunics, carried calluses on their hands, and thought about how to make something from nothing every single day. Edda knew them. She lived among them. In many ways, she was one of them. That there was Alden the smith, a man of few words and fewer indulgences. He couldn't read or write, but he understood airflow better than any scribe. One winter, after weeks of coughing and stinging eyes from the hearth smoke, he crafted a curved pipe out of clay and old ox bones. It redirected smoke from the fire, up and out through a stone crevice in his roof, clearing the air inside. Within days, the idea had spread through Glenleith, like warmth through wool. Edda's family was one of the first to adopt it, and for the first time in years, she could see the stars from the corner of their sleeping mat without choking on smoke. Then there was Maeve, the herbalist, not a healer in the formal sense. She had never studied under any scholar, but her knowledge of plants bordered on the sacred. She knew which roots could calm a nervous stomach and which leaves could draw frost from blackened toes. Her most remarkable discovery that winter was a simple compress made from clove sap and crushed bark soaked in warmed goat's milk. Applied to frostbite, it eased the pain and often reversed damage that others assumed permanent. She never boasted. She just gave. Edda herself contributed in ways she never imagined until she saw them catch on. The wall warmer she designed, stones heated by the fire and sandwiched between layers of wool and parchment, wasn't elegant, but it worked. And when others heard about it, they didn't ask for credit or claim the design as their own. They built on it, improved it, adapted it. Innovation in Glenleith was never about ownership. It was about shared survival. The children weren't left out either. They invented what they called fur pouches, tiny bundles of rabbit fur tied to cloth strings, worn under tunics, or stuffed into mittens to keep fingers from freezing. One boy, Tom, even figured out that placing pebbles in the hearth and dropping them into pockets could warm your core faster than hugging the fire itself. It was silly, maybe, but it worked, and that was enough. Even the village itself was a living invention. The way houses were positioned to break the wind. The snow walls built strategically to block drifts. The community's unwritten rule of walking in staggered paths to prevent deep snow from building these weren't random acts. They were collective. Knowledge, refined year after year by people who watched, learned, and shared. Torben, though quieter with age, contributed one of the most enduring ideas. After noticing that cold crept along the floor, and not just through walls, he began laying down paths of overlapping flat stones between sleeping areas and the hearth. When heated slightly during the day, they retained warmth long into the night. He said little about it, but Edda noticed her toes didn't ache the way they used to when she got up to stir the fire before dawn. None of these people would call themselves inventors. They didn't seek praise. Their work wasn't about legacy, it was about love. Love for those sleeping beside them, for those across the path, for the generations to come. They understood that surviving a winter like the one they faced required more than strength. It required imagination. It required seeing the invisible lines between problems and possibilities. Edda saw this clearly one night as she helped Magnus wrap a bit of cloth around a cup of warm broth. His hands were shaking, and they didn't have enough wood to keep the fire burning much longer. She remembered an old story Isolde told about ancestors who boiled flat stones, wrapped them, and used them as hand warmers. Edda tried it. It worked. Magnus smiled for the first time that day. None of these innovations would make it into the grand annals of history, but they would survive in practice, passed down by demonstration and word of mouth. The wall warmers, the fur pouches, the herbal compresses, they were Glenleith's legacy, written not on paper but into the rhythm of life. These were the forgotten heroes, the people who refused to accept the cold as the final word, who looked at frost not as a death sentence but as a challenge to be met with cleverness and heart. They didn't have titles, but they had impact. They didn't write doctrines, but they taught through doing, and perhaps that is how the world truly moves forward, not by the grand gestures of the famous, but by the quiet brilliance of the many. Edda believed that. She lived it, and long after the snow melted and the air softened, she carried their lessons like firelight in her chest, small, steady, and strong. By the time winter loosened its grip on Glenleith, the village had become quieter, not from silence, but from the stillness that follows long struggle. Snow still lined the edges of roofs, and frost still clung to shaded soil, but something had shifted. The air, though sharp, no longer felt cruel. And for Edda, that shift wasn't just outside. It was in her bones, in her breath, in the way she opened her eyes each morning with less dread and more wonder. Spring didn't arrive with trumpets or warmth all at once. It crept in quietly, like a visitor, unsure of its welcome. The first sign came not in temperature, but in sound. A trickle of melting snow from the roof, a soft creak in the trees, a single bird call that broke the monotony of winter's hush. Edda noticed it before anyone said it aloud. She woke one morning and found her breath no longer puffed into the air like mist. The air was still cold, yes, but not angry, not unforgiving. The village, too, seemed to exhale. People walked a little, slower through the paths, not from fatigue, but from the cautious hope that they might soon see Earth again. Torben sat outside for the first time in weeks, bundled in his thickest cloak, face turned to the sky as if listening for something. Maren sang while she worked, quietly at first, then louder as days passed. Magnus and Fletch chased each other through patches of slush, laughing in a way that seemed to warm the very ground beneath their feet. But it wasn't just the ending of winter they were feeling. It was the evidence of all they had carried through it. The ache in their joints, the missing buttons from worn cloaks, the deeper creases in their hands and hearts. These weren't marks of damage. They were signs of endurance, of having stood together against something vast and merciless and emerging, intact, if changed. One morning, Edda walked beyond the village's edge, to the grove, where the moss had once clung to stones under deep snow. She hadn't visited in weeks. The path was slippery, the wind still brisk, but she felt pulled. And there, nestled at the base of one rock, she saw it, green, fragile, quiet, a single sprig of moss pushing upward. She knelt before it, not daring to touch it, only watching, as it shivered in the breeze. It was enough to bring tears to her eyes. That moss, to her, wasn't just nature returning it, was memory. Of Maren's hands, gathering it, of Torben teaching her to feel its warmth, of the countless nights when a handful of it between two slats in the wall had made sleep possible. It was a living echo of their survival, proof that life, even after being buried under layers of ice and fear, always finds a way forward. Edda returned home with new resolve, not to forget the winter, but to carry its lessons, to rebuild not just what had been damaged, but what could now be imagined. She and Maren began pulling back the heavy cloths from the windows. Magnus helped rake paths through the softening snow, and even Torben began sketching ideas for a new kind of firewood, stack that might keep drier for next year. The thaw was not an erasure, was a transformation, a turning of page, not a tearing away. Everything the village had endured, the hunger, the cold, the uncertainty, had carved something new into their lives. Not scars, but strength. Not grief, but gratitude. And within that shift, Edda felt something awaken in her, not a childish hope, not a naive belief that hardship was gone forever, but a deeper knowing that she could face it again and again if needed. Because now she knew what she carried, the legacy of quiet courage, of whispered wisdom, of warmth shared even when none seemed to remain. As spring pressed further into Glenleith, the sun hung a little longer each day. The nights grew shorter. Fires were still lit, but more from habit than necessity. And laughter, honest open laughter, returned to the village paths like old friends. Edda stood in the doorway one evening, watching the horizon blush gold, and realized that spring hadn't just arrived in the land. It had arrived in her, not with flowers, not with warmth, but with the soft, unshakable truth that she had made it through. They all had, together, and now, the world was beginning again. In the end, Edda's story isn't just one of survival. It's a testament to what ordinary people can achieve when they choose resilience over surrender, love over indifference, and imagination over despair. Across the 9 chapters of her journey, we watched a young peasant girl not only face the coldest nights of her life, but transform them into something sacred, into lessons, rituals, and quiet acts of hope that reverberated far beyond her own family's hearth. She began as a daughter, bound to the daily rituals of winter survival. In the bleak shadows of Glenleith, Edda learned that fire wasn't just about heat, it was about heart. From the gentle precision of banking the coals to the silent act of placing a warm stone near her brother's feet, every movement was part of a larger tapestry woven with care, and that care was never hers alone. Maren's strength, Torben's wisdom, and even Magnus's childlike faith all became part of the equation. But what made Edda's journey so compelling wasn't only her endurance. It was her ability to turn endurance into innovation. When she crafted wall warmers out of stone and cloth, when she banked a fire so well it lasted through the longest night, when she shared dried apples at the midnight meal, she became more than a survivor. She became a builder of solutions, of community, and of meaning in every act. She reminded us that survival is not about avoiding hardship, it's about meeting it with open eyes, steady hands, and a generous heart. She didn't let fear make her bitter. She didn't let scarcity shrink her spirit. Instead, she found ways to stretch what little they had into something more, and in doing so, she helped Glenleith survive, not just as a place, but as a people. Edda's greatest transformation was internal. She began the winter just trying to stay alive. But by spring, she had become someone others looked to, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. She wasn't loud or commanding. She didn't lead from the front. She led from beside the fire, with her hands deep in wool, her eyes scanning for cracks in the wall, her ears tuned to every whisper of wind. She paid attention. She gave freely. She remembered that the lessons she learned weren't grand revelations. They were the kind that only reveal themselves when the stakes are high and the world is quiet. That warmth isn't just about heat, it's about being seen. That food isn't only fuel, it's memory. That shelter isn't just walls and a roof, it's the people who gather beneath it. When spring finally came, it wasn't a reward. It was a reminder that after all the darkness, the soul can still bloom. And now, standing on the other side of Edda's winter, we're left with a powerful question. What do we carry forward? Here's what we can take from her story and how it applies to us today in the modern world, where our winters may not be made of snow and frost, but of stress, uncertainty, loneliness, and fear. First, resilience is a muscle we build quietly. We don't need to be loud to be strong. Just like Edda, we can find power in rituals. Whether it's a morning routine, a shared meal, or a quiet walk at sunset, strength is in repetition, in choosing to show up again and again, even when no one's watching. Second, community is survival. In an age where isolation has become normal, we need to remember what Glenn Leith never forgot, that shared warmth saves lives. Whether it's a phone call to a friend, dropping off soup for a neighbor, or simply making eye contact with someone who feels invisible, those small acts matter. Edda's village didn't have abundance, but they had each other, and that was enough. Third, innovation doesn't need perfection. Most of Edda's creations were improvised, patched together from scraps and instinct, but they worked. You don't need to wait for ideal conditions to try something new. You don't need to be an expert to solve a problem. You just need to care enough to try. Fourth, faith is found in small things. Not everyone believes in the same way, but belief, whether in a higher power, in the rhythm of nature, or in your own ability to adapt, is what carries us through the coldest seasons. That soul candle Maren lit every night, that wasn't just flame, that was intention, that was hope held steady against the dark. Lastly, memory is a form of guidance. The stories we pass down, the traditions we keep alive, the names we remember, they're not just nostalgia. They are blueprints for living. They remind us that we are not the first to struggle, and we won't be the last. But if we honor the ones who came before us by learning what they learned and giving what they gave, we carry them forward into every new thaw. So ask yourself, what warmth do you carry? What small flame in your life deserves tending? What might you build from the scraps you've been handed? And now, I'd love to hear from you. Which part of Edda's journey spoke to you the most? Was it her quiet innovations and creativity under pressure, or the way her community came together with compassion and care? Her quiet, practical genius in surviving brutal cold, be the village's unwavering strength through shared support? Drop your answer in the comments below or beyond. Let's keep this conversation going. I'm reading all your thoughts, and your insights help this community grow. If this story touched you, inspired you, or gave you a moment to breathe a little deeper in your own life, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every click, every like, every share helps keep these stories alive and gives me the motivation to continue creating more. There are more tales like Edda's of forgotten resilience, of quiet power, of human brilliance, and I'd be honored to share them with you. So don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for walking through winter with me. Until next time, keep your fire lit.